Hi, here is another field test showing how Flared2 works. We're using Blender 4.2.3 and this scene is one I downloaded from blender.org. It's one of the demo scenes available there and I've used it several times before. I'd like to thank the author, though I can't recall his name at the moment. Anyway, if you go to blender.org, you can find where to download this scene, so thank you. As you can see, we have two flares in a scene that currently render entirely in Eevee. I'd like to introduce you to another aspect of Flared2 that I've been asked about several times on YouTube and other platforms, and that might be interest of many of you. How to use Flared for compositing in an external application rather than directly within the render. Now, if I render the scene, I get a static image with the flare rendered along with the main subject, whether I'm using Eevee or Cycles. Of course, Cycle will be slower. For now, I'm working with 8 samples in preview mode using the optic denoiser because I have an NVIDIA card. I'm using a low sample count for the render. 32 is a bit low, so I use 64 for better results. I also go to the camera settings and disable depth of field because it's currently causing problems by blurring the flare, and in this case we don't want it. As you can see, the flare looks off. Don't worry, if you've watched some of our video, you'll know that the flares need transparency to work properly. In Cycles, transparency is set to 8 by default. But since every element of the flare is transparent, 8 is too low. Let's increase the transparency level to fix this issue. Maybe 32 will work better, or more, I don't know. Keep in mind, always increase the light path transparency when working in Cycles. This is very important. The value you set depends on how many transparent elements you have in the scene. The more you increase it, the longer the render time. So don't overdo it just to avoid artifacts. You could end up with extremely slow renders. This problem can also be solved using the method I'll explain shortly. If you render the scene now, it will take a little time, but in the end, we'll get our render with the flare. The result will be identical to what we'd get with Eevee, mainly because this scene was designed for Eevee and doesn't fully utilize Cycles' potentials. I forgot to enable denoising, but that's not an issue. Let's move on. The solution I'm going to show you is useful for both those who want to significantly reduce the render times in Cycles when using Flare, and for those who want to export the Cycles render scene separately from the Flare. Cycles or Eevee, it's the same. This allows you to go into external application like After Effects or DaVinci Resolve or others for compositing. Here we have the render options settings, which is exactly what we need. We have to enable it, and once we do, we'll be asked if we want to auto set up the compositing node. This is crucial. If you're familiar with compositing and already have nodes set up in your Blender scene, you might prefer to set up the nodes manually, especially because there are only 3 nodes to set up. This is because enabling this option will overwrite any existing nodes in the compositor, but I'm assuming you're not using the compositor since you probably want to handle the compositing externally. So I'll enable the auto setup for compositing nodes and confirm. Visually, nothing changes, whether you're using Cycles or Eevee, because this option works with both render engine. We can continue modifying the flare. Now we have 2 in the scene, 1 red and 1 blue. We can resize or tweak them without any issue. Visually, it's the same, nothing is different. Although Cycles isn't ideal for these types of adjustments, we can still work on the flares, perhaps using Eevee for a faster preview. We can choose the desired camera angle and then proceed with rendering. But first, let's take a look at the compositing window to understand what the render function we activated actually did. In the compositor, which you can open from here, we see two inputs being blended with a mix node set to add, which is then sent to the output. These two inputs are the scene without effects and the flare. Let's see what happens when we render, for example, in Eevee to keep it fast. Once the render is complete, I close the render window, which we don't need, and check what's going on below. I activate the viewer by pressing Ctrl, Shift, and clicking on Add, which shows me the preview of the scene without effects. If I send this directly to the viewer, I can see the raw scene without the flare. The other input, meanwhile, is the lens flare on a black background. This is crucial for compositing because the data we're manipulating is based on light, not on transparency. So there's no alpha channel, only light information that gets added to the existing scene. All we need to do is use a mix node set to add to get the final blend of the flare and the scene. This method works in both Eevee and Cycles. But let me show you something more. Earlier, you saw how long it took to render the scene in Cycles, about a few dozen seconds. Rendering again took much less time, only 5 seconds. Why? Because this smart feature allows the system to render the scene with Cycles and only render the flare with Eevee. We've seen this before, and it works seamlessly with Cycles and Eevee. So the flare rendered quickly because Eevee, unlike Cycles, handles transparency in a much simpler and faster way. The result is the same, but Eevee works in real time while Cycles doesn't. This is fantastic for those looking to speed up render times. For those working with an external compositor, it's incredibly convenient for another reason. With just a few changes to the compositor settings, you can choose to save these two files simultaneously in separate folders, while also selecting the file format you prefer. The compositor is powerful, allowing you to add output nodes, just like the file output node. I can duplicate it, sending one render to one output and the other render to a different output. By selecting a node, you can check which setting it offers and specify a path for where you want to save the flare. This is exactly the same output window you have here, but now you have two, one for the flare and another for the base image. The flare doesn't need RGBA, it's just RGB. PNG works great, Targa works great, TIFF works great. You can choose based on your system. Similarly, you can choose where to save the other file. This is super convenient, especially if you are working with animations, because when you run the render animation, it happens in real time without causing any slowdown. This lets you handle any additional compositing later in external compositor. I hope everything is clear. If not, feel free to ask any question below this video or through the store where you purchased Flared2. This feature was already available in Flared1, both in standard and in XT versions. Maybe it was a bit harder to manage, maybe a bit complex. I honestly can't remember now. Since we're transitioning to Flared2, we're doing all of the experiment on this new version and moving away from Flared1. However, we'll continue to support anyone who needs help for Flared1. On my YouTube channel, that is this one, you can find a playlist called Flared and Glared, explaining external compositing with the older version of Flared, which many of you will use until November 6th. Starting on November 7th, anyone who pre-order will be able to use Flared2, free and forever. We hope you love it. Bye!